Rajiv Malhotra, a respected police inspector, and Priya Sharma, the bright young daughter of his next-door neighbor, seemed worlds apart, until a secret affair bound them together in a chain of lies, obsession, and betrayal that would explode into a night of unimaginable bloodshed. In the peaceful lanes of a small town in Rajasthan, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The streets were lined with tall neem trees that provided shade to children playing cricket in the afternoons, and neighbors often stopped to chat over their garden fences. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name, where a stranger walking down the road would quickly become the subject of conversation. In this quiet setting lived Inspector Rajiv Malhotra, a man whose name was spoken with respect across the neighborhood. His tall, imposing figure and neatly pressed uniform were symbols of authority, and his reputation for solving difficult cases had earned him admiration both inside and outside the police department. To his neighbors, Rajiv was more than just a police officer. He was a man who attended community events, helped settle disputes, and always offered a courteous nod to passers-by. His life seemed picture-perfect. He lived in a modest but well-kept house with his wife, Anita, who worked as a schoolteacher in the nearby primary school. The couple had been married for over 15 years, and while they had no children, they appeared content in each other's company. They often hosted small gatherings, and Rajiv would sometimes be seen helping Anita carry groceries or water the plants in their front yard. Next door, in the Sharma household, life was equally ordinary. Mr. Sharma worked as a bank manager, and his wife, Sunita, took pride in running a neat home. Their daughter, Priya, was the center of their world. At 22, she was a law student in Jaipur, returning home only during breaks from her studies. Priya had grown up in this neighborhood, and Rajiv had known her since she was a child, often waving to her when she passed his house on her way to school. She had blossomed into a confident young woman, with a bright smile and a quick wit that made her popular among friends and family. When Priya returned for her semester break that summer, the neighborhood seemed livelier. She would often be seen walking her dog in the evenings or sitting in the garden reading a book. Rajiv would occasionally run into her when leaving for work or returning from his patrols. At first, their exchanges were brief and polite, just the friendly greetings of long-time neighbors. But Rajiv found himself noticing her more than before. The sound of her laughter when she spoke to her parents drifted through the open windows next door, and he caught himself glancing in that direction more often than he intended. Behind the walls of his home, however, Rajiv's marriage was not as harmonious as it appeared. Years of unspoken resentment and small arguments had created a silent distance between him and Anita. She immersed herself in her work at school, while Rajiv buried himself in his duties at the station. Conversations became routine, stripped of warmth. To the world, their marriage was steady. To them, it felt hollow. It was in this fragile emotional space that Priya's presence began to take root in Rajiv's mind, subtle at first, then growing into something that neither of them could have predicted. At first, their interactions seemed harmless, the kind of neighborly exchanges no one would think twice about. Priya would sometimes stop by the Malhotra house to drop off a plate of sweets her mother had made, and Rajiv would thank her politely, asking about her studies and life in the city. Sometimes Anita would be at work when Priya came by, and Rajiv would invite her to sit for a moment, offering her tea. These brief moments began to stretch into longer conversations. They discovered a shared interest in literature. Rajiv had a small shelf of crime novels and legal thrillers, and Priya enjoyed discussing the cases and moral dilemmas within them. Priya found herself drawn to the way Rajiv listened. Unlike the boys her age, he spoke with a calm authority and an air of confidence that made her feel understood. For Rajiv, it was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Someone looking at him not as an officer or a husband, but as a man worth listening to. What started as neighborly warmth began to carry an undercurrent of something more. The exchanges became slightly longer, the pauses between words lingering just a bit too long. Their meetings soon grew more intentional. Priya would find reasons to visit when Anita's scooter was gone from the driveway, knowing she was at work. Rajiv, in turn, adjusted his lunch breaks so he could be home when she arrived. At times he offered to help her with errands, dropping her off at the library, carrying shopping bags to her house. The town was small, and people paid attention, so Rajiv used his position to be discreet. He had access to local CCTV feeds and made a habit of checking the cameras near their homes, deleting any recordings that might show Priya visiting at odd hours. When the summer heat became oppressive, Rajiv suggested they meet in more secluded spots. He would park his police jeep in an alleyway near the abandoned railway tracks, telling anyone who asked that he was patrolling. Priya would meet him there under the guise of visiting friends. They would sit in the shade of the vehicle, talking for hours, their conversations drifting from studies and work to their personal frustrations and desires. But secrets have a way of breeding recklessness. They began taking bigger risks. Priya once entered Rajiv's house through the back door while Anita was in the front yard watering plants, and slipped out minutes later without being noticed. Another time, they met at a quiet roadside tea stall just outside town, where Rajiv paid the owner to keep silent. They believed they had built an unbreakable shield around themselves. What they didn't realize was that in a place where every movement is noticed, curiosity can grow quickly. Neighbors began to whisper when they saw Rajiv's jeep parked oddly close to Priya's college hostel during her trips back to Jaipur. One evening, Mr. Sharma asked Priya casually why she seemed to know so much about the police station's internal matters. Though she brushed it off with a laugh, the seed of suspicion had been planted. Anita had always been observant, the kind of woman who noticed when a picture frame was slightly tilted, or when her husband's tone changed by the smallest degree. At first, she ignored the faint traces, an unfamiliar scent of perfume on Rajiv's shirts, a shift in his schedule, the way he sometimes returned home looking distracted and distant. But the signs began to stack up. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, she found a delicate silver bracelet tucked between the cushions of the sofa. It wasn't hers, and she knew immediately it didn't belong there. She slipped it into her pocket without a word, her mind already racing. Rajiv, meanwhile, had started to behave differently around Priya in public. He was careful not to touch her or speak for too long where others could see, but there was a change in his expression when she was near, a lightness in his smile that Anita hadn't seen directed at her in years. At first, she told herself she was imagining things, that perhaps she was becoming paranoid. But then she began to notice that Priya's visits to their home always seemed to coincide with Anita's absence. In the Sharma household, unease was also brewing. Priya's father had begun to notice her unusual comings and goings. She was evasive when asked where she had been, and sometimes she returned home with a faint flush on her cheeks, as if from excitement or nervousness. He dismissed it as the natural secrecy of a young adult, but his wife, Sunita, was less convinced. She quietly began watching from their window, noting that Priya often lingered near the Malhotra home, sometimes glancing around before slipping inside. Rajiv's attempts to keep things hidden began to unravel when his own caution wavered. On several occasions, he drove Priya home in his police jeep, parking it just far enough from her gate to avoid notice, but not far enough to escape the attention of sharp-eyed neighbors. Word spread quietly, carried in hushed conversations between women at the local temple and whispered exchanges over market stalls. Anita's suspicions turned to certainty the day she decided to follow her husband. It was a humid afternoon, and she told him she had a late meeting at school. Instead, she parked her scooter near the park and waited. Rajiv's jeep arrived minutes later, and Priya stepped out from a shaded corner, her face lighting up as she saw him. Anita watched as they walked together toward a secluded area, their heads bent close. The sight was enough to send a wave of cold fury through her. She left without confronting them, her silence now heavy with purpose. That evening, Anita avoided speaking to Rajiv, but he sensed a change. Priya, too, began to feel the tension. Her parents had announced plans to send her abroad to complete her studies, an idea she didn't dare tell Rajiv right away. When she finally did, his reaction was sharper than she expected. For Rajiv, the thought of her leaving was unthinkable. The cracks in their carefully constructed secret were now wide enough for danger to slip through. The air that night was thick and heavy, the kind of oppressive August heat that clung to the skin and made tempers short. Rajiv paced inside his living room, checking his watch every few minutes. He had convinced Priya to come over, telling her Anita would be gone for the evening to attend a staff dinner. His plan was simple: spend a few hours alone with her, away from the eyes and whispers of the neighborhood, and talk about what they would do once she left for her studies abroad. But beneath his calm tone on the phone, his thoughts churned with desperation. The idea of her leaving had been gnawing at him for days, and tonight he wanted an answer. Priya arrived quietly, slipping in through the side gate as she had done before. She was cautious, scanning the street before entering, but inside she seemed distracted. She tried to make light conversation, yet her eyes avoided his for too long. Rajiv felt the distance and pressed her to talk. She hesitated, then admitted that her parents had already started the process of sending her overseas. She would be gone in a few months, maybe for years, and she didn't know if it was worth holding onto something that would be nearly impossible to sustain. Her words struck him like a blow, and he felt a tightening in his chest. Unbeknownst to them, Anita's staff dinner had been cancelled due to a sudden power outage at the school. She returned home earlier than expected, her scooter's quiet hum going unnoticed as it approached the gate. When she walked into the house, the sound of voices reached her from the living room. She stepped inside to find Priya sitting on the sofa, and Rajiv standing nearby, his body angled toward her in a way that told Anita more than words ever could. The moment froze for just a second before it shattered. Anita's shock turned to rage, her voice rising sharply. Priya jumped to her feet, insisting she should leave, but Rajiv stepped in front of her, his own tone escalating as he tried to control the situation. The room became a storm of accusations and denials, the heat outside mirrored by the heat in their words. Priya tried to move toward the door, but Anita blocked her path, the argument now spiraling beyond anything rational. Rajiv felt trapped between the two women, his wife's fury and his lover's fear, and something inside him snapped. In a sudden, unthinking rush, he shoved Anita aside, the force sending her staggering into the kitchen counter. She grabbed at a knife lying there, more in panic than intent, but Rajiv wrestled it from her. The struggle was brief and brutal. In seconds, Anita lay still, her body crumpled on the kitchen floor. Priya stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror. She tried to run, but Rajiv, driven by a mix of fear and the need to silence the witness to what had just happened, caught her by the arm. In the chaos that followed, she fell, hitting her head on the corner of the heavy wooden coffee table. Blood began to pool on the floor, the dark red spreading slowly across the tiles. Rajiv's breathing was ragged as the reality of what he had done set in. His training as a police officer kicked in, not to save them, but to hide the crime. He smashed a window with a vase, scattering glass onto the floor, overturned a chair, and pulled open drawers to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. But no matter how much he tried to disguise the scene, the smell of blood and the silence of the two lifeless bodies told the real story. Rajiv stood in the center of the living room, chest heaving, his shirt damp with sweat. The house felt unnaturally silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Outside, the street was calm, but inside, two bodies lay still, one in the kitchen, the other in the living room, each a witness to his downfall. He forced himself to move, stepping carefully over the spreading pools of blood. His mind raced through every crime scene he had ever examined, every mistake criminals had made that led to their capture. He told himself he could do better, that he could erase the truth. He began by washing his hands and face, scrubbing until the skin turned red. He changed into a clean uniform, placing the blood-stained one in a plastic bag, which he locked inside a cabinet in the storeroom. He picked up the knife from the kitchen, wiped it hastily, and placed it near Anita's hand, hoping it would suggest she had tried to defend herself during a supposed break-in. The smashed window remained as the centerpiece of his staged chaos, glass scattered across the floor like jagged confetti. Drawers were pulled open, jewelry boxes tipped over, and a few valuables tossed on the ground to mimic a hurried theft. When he was satisfied, or at least convinced himself he was, he called the police station, reporting a home invasion gone wrong. His voice was measured, almost convincing, but he knew the officers who would arrive were the same ones who had worked cases by his side. They would notice details he couldn't hide. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up outside, red and blue lights flashing across the walls. Neighbors began to gather, whispering among themselves as uniformed men entered the Malhotra home. From the moment the first officer stepped inside, things began to unravel. There were no signs of forced entry except for the obviously broken window, and the glass lay more inside the house than outside, a detail any trained investigator would spot. The valuables scattered on the floor were untouched, something that didn't fit with a robbery. And most damning of all, there was the timeline. A neighbor reported hearing shouting just minutes before the crash of glass, not after. Forensics arrived, their gloves snapping as they worked. Swabs were taken from the floor, the walls, and even Rajiv's skin. Blood spatter analysis quickly revealed that both women had been attacked in close proximity to him. The locked cabinet in the storeroom, which he had hoped to keep hidden, was opened under the pretext of a routine search. Inside, the bag containing his stained uniform was found, the fabric still damp from where he had tried to clean it. In the interrogation room, Rajiv tried to maintain his story, but the weight of evidence was crushing. Confronted with the forensic reports, the witness statements, and the inconsistencies in his account, he finally broke. His confession came haltingly at first, then spilled out in a rush, how the affair had begun, how it had spiraled out of control, and how, in a moment of fear and rage, he had destroyed everything. The trial was swift and heavily covered by local and national media. Photos of Rajiv in handcuffs dominated headlines, the story of the respected inspector turned murderer, captivating the public. The town that once admired him now spoke his name with disgust. The Sharma family was left shattered, their only daughter gone, while Anita's relatives grieved the loss of a woman who had trusted the wrong man. When the sentence was read, life imprisonment without parole, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of the judge's gavel. Rajiv was led away, his head bowed, the weight of his choices pressing down like a final, unrelenting verdict. The quiet streets of the town would never look at their protector the same way again, a reminder that even those sworn to uphold the law could become the very criminals they once chased.